You don't look so good, Mom.
Nothing a big ol' hug and kiss from you won't fix. Open up now.
When did April become the horror theatrical release month? It seems like all of a sudden April there's just like a bunch of horror movies coming out. I mean, I'm fine with it, but when did that happen? Evil Dead Rise is a 2023 horror film about a woman who, while visiting her family, gets trapped inside of that building with them as a demonic force is unleashed on them. Now, it's funny. If someone were to ask me what an Evil Dead movie would be, I don't know if I could really answer that. And I've been a fan of the series for, I don't know, 30 years or so. When I first saw Army of Darkness in the theaters back in 1993. But I ended up watching it in reverse order. I saw the second one next, and then I saw the first one after that. I mean, basically, it was sort of mainly because of availability. The crazy thing is how each time Evil Dead has popped up over the years, it changes its tone or scope in general. So, the first one was a full indie horror. Second one was this kind of tongue-in-cheek style coolness with camp to go along with like some genuinely creepy imagery. Then the third one just went full comedy action, and the horror was more of like a setting versus a feeling. Also giving us this kind of crazy ego-driven action hero in Ash. And then that led to some video games and then some different teasings and further incantations of the character, all kind of keeping mostly with the comedy horror aspect of the previous two movies. Then we got the remake in 2013, Evil Dead, which went back to its sort of dead serious tone. And I'll be honest, I don't really remember much of this movie. I mean, partly because it felt like it was just sort of a collection of Easter eggs kind of thrown into a blender and then jacked up to 11. It all kind of came off as a little meh to me. Then shortly after that, we got the Ash vs. Evil Dead series, where not only does Ash come back, but the camp comedy horror tone is back with it. It was a charming, fun little show that was probably better than it had any right to be, but I do feel like they fumbled the end game a little bit, and it does sound like producer Robert Tappert did some course correcting at the end that was a bit of a head scratcher, but for the most part, it was fairly well received. Anyway, that brings us up to the present, where this is a sequel of sorts, only in that it kind of has to do with the Book of the Dead. I mean, everything else seems to have been jettisoned or repurposed along with this more religious kind of backstory. Now, in this time that we kind of live in this sort of constant reboots or reimaginings or remakes or legacy sequels, it's kind of easy to criticize things that aren't the same or that feel different from sort of the original content. But usually when these things happen, it's by a whole new crew of people. And so it's easy to make that argument of like, well, they just don't get X, right? But in this situation, it is still Rob Tappert as the main producer, and both Raimi and Bruce Campbell are executive producers on the film. So I'm not sure how much they actually were involved creatively. I mean, my hunch is not much, but I really don't know. So for all I know, they were all fully on board with everything in this movie, in which case, who am I to say whether this feels like an Evil Dead movie or not? In that sense, I'm going to refrain from kind of going down that road and just evaluate this as a horror movie in general, as though it has nothing to do with the previous ones, because for the most part, it really doesn't. This story centers around Beth, who is a guitar tech for a traveling band and is labeled as a bit of a wild child of sorts, traveling with bands, drugs, alcohol, that sort of thing. She ends up finding out that she is pregnant and decides that she needs to visit her sister Ellie for help in finding out what she should do. Ellie has 3 kids in a rundown apartment building, which her and apparently everyone else in the building was recently evicted from, so that the building could be torn down, I think. We didn't get much info on this, but I mean, basically, Ellie, who is newly divorced, has her own problems of trying to raise 3 kids on her own while also needing to move out of a building that is about to be torn down. The kids in question are Bridget, Danny, and Cassie. While they're all in this apartment building in California, an earthquake hits, and it ends up opening up this hole in the basement floor, which used to be a bank 100 years ago. Danny ends up finding this old book and a set of records, which obviously we as the audience know this as the Book of the Dead. He has obviously no idea, and that's really the only connection to the previous movies. Luckily, he's an aspiring DJ, so he happens to have a record player in his room and is able to play the records, which then unwittingly unleashes the demonic force, setting the whole movie in motion, which is really convenient. And that's kind of a running theme with this movie. There are a lot of plot conveniences throughout the runtime. Now, I'll be honest, if this movie had stopped probably halfway through or maybe a third of the way through, I probably would have said I did not like this movie at all. I mean, it just has no sense of building atmosphere, where I feel like it's just a little too eager to jump to the next set piece. And it really twists itself in knots to kind of replicate the isolation of being in a cabin in the woods. I was really surprised by this because, the director Lee Cronin did a very underrated movie called A Hole in the Ground, which was this sort of slow burn, patiently done horror film that I thought really built tension well. And the idea that this movie kind of goes in the exact opposite direction, I was certainly not expecting from him, which was a bit disappointing through at least the first half. However, the movie didn't stop halfway through, thankfully, and I surprisingly did find that the movie began to kind of win me over a little bit as it went along. Probably not enough, unfortunately, but some. Now, I could dive deeper into like a point-by-point breakdown of what the story is, but this movie doesn't really lend itself to that. There isn't much of a story. It kind of just follows the beats as to wherever it needs to go within the moment it needs to do it. So once you know the setup, that's kind of it. It's like pushing a bike down a hill. It's just going to go in a straight line until it gets to the end. I mean, there are no real twists and turns. There's no shocking revelations. No real surprises in general. I mean, for better or worse, this movie lives and dies by its ability to both shock and awe and its style. Okay, let me back up for a quick second. I want to talk a little bit about atmosphere and specifically tension. For my personal tastes, the things that I enjoy the most out of a horror movie is the suspense and the tension. Now, I love blood and gore as well, but only if it serves the tension element. Now, there are scary visuals, and then there are scary scenes. Now, it's not about the visual itself for me, but about the setup of the circumstance and the buildup around it that kind of gives it its weight and changes it from being a scary visual to being a scary moment or scene. To me, a scary scene will stick with me long after the movie, whereas kind of a scary visual is good in the moment, but that's kind of it. It's why a trailer can have super creepy imagery, but it won't really stick with me like a feature film can. This movie doesn't seem to have any interest in setting or building tension. I mean, how could it? It never has any time to breathe. I mean, I know there are two credited writers on this, but the whole movie feels like a writer's room situation where they make this gigantic list on a whiteboard of what things they find scary or creepy. Then from that list, they kind of just made a story that's able to jump from one thing to the next with a stopwatch running where every 2 minutes, you gotta hit one of those things on the list. What that ends up creating is this sort of weird, kind of nonsensical horror moments with this very loose connection to motivation or reality. I mean, it just becomes like this laundry list of spooky things. Cracking whole eggs in a pan for some reason. Spider or crab walking. My God, this is literally in every horror movie now. Creepy bone snapping sounds every time someone moves, crouching on the counter for no reason at all, eating glass, uplighting everywhere, creepy lines and sayings, walking on the ceiling, yelling with distended mouths, loud noises all over the place. Like, these are all things that we've seen, and this movie does them well, but it also just doesn't feel like it's part of the story. It feels like it's just part of a list of things that they need to do. However, what started to win me over a bit is I'll say this. The movie definitely doesn't play it safe and really does go for it. Now, there are certain expectations when you're dealing with a family in a tight situation like this. And this movie really does go no holds barred and charge full steam ahead and being somewhat unrelenting in its charge to the end of the film. And I can appreciate that. I can appreciate that if still disappointed that it went down this road in the first place. At least it went all in. I much prefer a swing for the fences and a miss rather than a safe bunt just to make contact, or even worse, like never taking the bat off your shoulders. And this movie definitely swings for the fences. So despite the fact that this story doesn't really hold up to much scrutiny, and there are some real dumb story elements here. I mean, the story in general borders between relatively non-existent or just plain irrelevant. And the beat-to-beat motivations are questionable at best. I did get slightly won over by its kind of insane levels of blood and gore and the creative use of its special effects. The acting is all really good. I mean, Alyssa Sutherland plays a great demon, and although the kids are just kind of okay and don't quite hold up as the movie goes on, they also don't detract from the movie, even if they don't add much. But I do think its inability or desire to slow down for even a second and build some actual tension cost it from being a really good horror movie that would stick with you long after it's done. I really fear that this movie is going to end up kind of like the last one, where in a year I'll forget most, if not everything, on what it was about. I'd give it a B-, but let me know what you think.